Again, we're so glad everybody's here, and let's take a deep cleansing breath to build awareness about where we are as individuals at this moment, where there might be stress or distracting thoughts and feelings in our mind or in our heart or in our bodies. Just take a big deep cleansing breath. And release. Do a quick check of what thoughts are racing through your mind without judging them as good or bad. What feelings are arising in your hearts? Again, without judgment, just acknowledging what's going on in your interior self. And likewise in your body, do you have some tension, some stress, some pain? Just take note of it and then let it go. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our presenters today, and that's our senior pastor, Ron, and LeAnn Pope.
Thank you, Jeffrey, and welcome again, everybody. It's wonderful to be here on this morning. I know we look forward to the time when we can do this in person, but until then, it's so important and so enriching for us to be able to see each other's faces. Every time I see faces of our congregants, or even I get an email, I feel a little more connected in this time of disconnection. So it's great to be with you all. And want to jump right in, but before we do that, LeAnn, why don't you introduce your special support group or your special team that are on the call so we can take care of that note of hospitality first.
So my first special guest is my mother. I know she is here somewhere. My dad and my stepmom said they would be joining too, but I don't see them yet. And of course, my wonderful husband, who is only known as CSM, but has no video going. Perhaps he hasn't showered yet.
Well, as Jeffrey said, you know, there are really no restrictions. Even the unwashed masses can get into these calls. So it's very important as a church of welcome to do that. But welcome everybody, and welcome to all those who LeAnn just welcome, and welcome to you again, LeAnn. And thank you again for being part of this conversation and the conversation that will continue next Sunday morning. And for the chance to have been in conversation with you on behalf of Jeffrey and myself, the church, and the interview we had this past Wednesday. As everybody knows, our church has 4 conversational threads, and they're more than just conversations. They're ongoing points of engagement, they're lenses, they're calls to action and to reflection. And one of them is anti-racism. And today's conversation and next week's as well, and all those that it will factor into, others that will be sparked by this, are really a very important part of that ongoing work. It's about discernment, it's about action, it's about reflection, it's about what can we do to change the reality of racism. And we're very excited to pick up on the conversation that LeAnn and I were able to start this past Wednesday in our interview, and to really build on and to delve into her master's thesis entitled From Colorblind to Clearer Vision, a White Christian's Unexpected Journey Toward Redemption. And so we want this conversation today, as Jeffrey and I were talking about how we wanted to structure it, to really be very much your conversation, all of you, an open forum for you to be able to ask the questions that are on your hearts, your minds, prompted by the paper and perhaps prompted by topics that the paper points to, but certainly grounding it in the paper itself as a great springboard for this week and next week's conversation. So to open it up, LeAnn and I thought it might be helpful for her to just give a very brief summary of what she feels are the salient points, the highlights of her thesis, and then we can again open it up for conversation from there. So LeAnn, take it away.
All right, thank you, and good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you for showing up, getting up, and showing up. My my paper, which was done in May of this year, is really a it's all about my spiritual, intellectual, and theological journey, exploring race and racism. Now, I know a lot of master's theses are an academic exercise. I can assure you that this one is not. While it's certainly past academic muster, it really is a journey of faith and intellectual exercise. To highlight some of the things that I find are most salient to my papers, first of all, I come at this from a point of real humility, because in this paper, I acknowledge my views of race and racism that I have held for years, many, many years. And in my exploration with examining those views through research, through classes, and mostly through my work in the South Side with the young men from CRED, I came to learn that the views that I had held for so many years were really not based in truth or in fact. I examined those in my paper. In order, and we are all different. You know, you all are going through your own reflection, critique of race and racism, because if you were not, you wouldn't be in this spiritual enrichment group right now. I mean, the fact that you are here says that we are all going through our own version of our own journey. And for me, because I started with the premise that systemic racism ended with the Civil Rights Act and with the enactment of lots of other federal legislation involving housing and fair credit and things like that, what I needed to do personally is I needed to dig very deep in African-American history so that I could find a thread. I wasn't looking for one. I didn't realize it would happen until I did the research. And the purpose of this deep dive in African-American history is to understand from slavery to Reconstruction to Jim Crow to civil rights to all the laws and legislation that really operated to keep in place this caste system that our country was founded upon. And the caste system is one in which people with light colored skin are considered at the top and people with dark colored skin are considered at the bottom. I personally needed to do the factual analysis to understand how we got to where we are today. Because to be part of a movement to deconstruct how we got here, I needed to understand how it was constructed. So that the research, the discussion is all in my paper. The last part of the paper, which I believe we will get into more next week, is the theological portion. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that now, but just let me entice you by telling you that for years, I was a real critic of pastors who talked about social justice from the pulpit. I thought the pulpit was no place to discuss issues of race, racism, and white supremacy. I have changed on that point also. So that's just a short overview.
LeAnn, thank you for just refreshing for those of us that had a chance to read your paper, and for those that perhaps have not had a chance, we certainly encourage everybody to do that, at least to skim it if you can. It's extremely well written, deeply researched, very objectively presented, also very confessional, and that humility is woven throughout all of it. And I think that's the note that I feel is probably most important for all of us, is to continue to come from a place of humility as we're looking at this very difficult topic. So we want to open it up and just ask, what questions do you all have on your hearts and minds? And Jeffrey and I will do our best to monitor who is raising their hands. Jeffrey's going to kind of monitor the chat. If you want to post questions, you can use that chat function. And we want to just ask, what questions would you like to ask of LeAnn?
And some of you are not visible or even maybe on the phone, and you'll probably just have to unmute yourself and go ahead and speak. Others can raise their hand. There are two screens, so I'll have to be toggling between the two to look for hands. I see JS. Go ahead, JS.
Whenever this topic comes up within the group, what comes to my mind is, how do you know what you don't really know? How do you go through that process of discovering what you don't know?
Oh my gosh, JS, leave it to you to ask the $10 million question. Let me do my best to answer that question. The answer is, you learn what you don't know, and you become aware of what you don't know by talking with other people. And for me, I realized through my own research and my own journey that the extent to which I had been wearing blinders for so many years was astounding to me. And the reason why I learned that I was so blind to the experiences that our African-American brothers and sisters have on a daily basis is that because I have never had to think about the color of my skin, whether it's in employment or a job interview, or simply walking into a store or a building, or walking down the street in a neighborhood, because I've never had to think about those things because of the color of my skin, I truly was oblivious to what was going on with our African-American brothers and sisters. And it wasn't until I started listening to their stories, to their heartache, to the pain that they have felt all their lives, that my eyes then slowly started to open. But we have to listen, and we have to try to hear, and only through the dialogues like this, and especially dialogues with the Black voice, we have to hear what they have to say. And then we may need help within the white community to process that. But that is such a good question. But you can only know what you don't know when you start examining and talking to other people. If you stay in your own little shelter, your own little silo, and you don't want to see what perhaps the world really looks like through somebody else's eyes, we've got the ability to do that. Those of us who identify as white, we don't have to examine these issues at all. That's one of our privileges. We can just put it aside and go about our daily business. But for those of us who really want to start waking up and to see the pain that folks who occupy Black bodies have had for years, those of us who want to do that, and I believe firmly that those of us who choose to follow Jesus Christ, that is something that we are called to do. And when we are called to do that, it's amazing what happens when we allow God to start changing our hearts. And it is a process. It's a process.
LeAnn, can you just say a little bit, given the nature of your paper and what spurred so many of your insights, about the importance of reading and research? You talk about talking with people. Certainly you've done that in your work with your cohorts and the CRED program, very intense, direct conversation. But what's the role of research, and how did that play into your change of heart and mind and coming to know what you didn't?
Yeah, for me, it was very important. And it also had to do with the way, being a lawyer, my mind is not a creative mind. My mind is analytical. I need to go where the facts are. And so it was natural for me to go to where the facts are, but I'll tell you why I had to do it. Because I really believed for years that equal opportunity in this country was available for everybody since 1964. You just had to work for it. So those folks who didn't have the opportunities that I had, my assumption was because they just didn't work for it. I needed to break that down by seeing this thread I'm talking about throughout all of our US history of whenever there is advancement by Black folks, there's this counterforce pushing them back. So it wasn't until I did the research, and this is not, subjective opinion pieces I'm reading. I'm reading pieces by historical scholars because that's where I gravitate to. And it was only when I saw that, oh my gosh, because of all this, the laws and policies and systems that have been in place, like redlining. we assume that blacks and whites live separately because we just want to associate with people who look like us. The problem with that is the underlying assumption that black folks had a choice of where they wanted to live. So when I started researching all of this, it started making sense to me. That's why Chicago is segregated. There's that and other reasons why the violent and poor neighborhoods on the South Side are black. But I needed to attach the historical and often legal premise for why we are the way that we are today. Now some folks may decide they don't need to know African-American history. And that's fine. I've talked to a lot of white folks, they just want to jump in and work. And I get that too. But it was because I have such a better understanding of where we've been in this country that I believe so firmly in change for the future. And I think if you don't take that step to educate yourselves on African-American history, you're going to miss the stuff that really gives you the foundational basis for why we can change and how we must change.
Thank you, LeAnn.
I saw Jen Guy, you had a question. And again, anybody else who has a question, you can put it in the chat or a comment, or use your reactions buttons at the bottom, and there's a raise hand feature there. Jen?
So many options. Nice, Jeffrey. It's so nice to see everybody. Back on this whole topic of learning what we don't know or having a more nuanced understanding of what we know to be the truth. And of course, this is the problem, because you're talking about talking to one another, but because when you're in a caste system, you don't talk to one another. So you get into that catch-22 situation. How do you talk? Anyway, I guess my thinking this week has been directed, and because of LeAnn's paper on the GI Bill, which the anniversary of the passing of the GI Bill was this week. And because the GI Bill was so important in my family's growth out of non-education, going from a group of farmers who didn't expect to get anything more than an 8th grade education to a family that expected to get education. That turning point was the GI Bill. Mm-hmm. So when I read LeAnn's paper and just got into the research on the GI Bill and how it was used to sort of like affirmative action. It was affirmative action. It was one of our early affirmative action programs, but it was only for white males. And the downstream effect of that is staggering, of course. But anyway, so LeAnn, I was just hoping you might talk a little bit about how you found out and who is studying this and who is putting out some of these things that happened in the 30s and 40s that now have a profound effect on us now, almost 100 years later.
Yeah, Jennifer, I have a list of resources that I have used, and there is one in particular that you would really appreciate. It is When Affirmative Action Was White. It's by an historian. I'll make my list of resources available through Jeffrey, and he can make it available to everyone. But here was the fascinating thing about the GI Bill. And this is how a lot of laws then on their face are neutral. There is nothing discriminatory about the GI Bill on the face of it. It didn't say white folks only should apply. It was in the application of that legislation where they gave the southern states authority to hand out the money. So if you allow the states to control the money, you know, a lot of this stuff is happening still today. You allow the states to control the money, and the money then goes into the banks, into the southern states. Well, you really think they're going to give loans to blacks? That's where they had the control and the authority to do that. This whole thing about the GI Bill was entirely new to me. Once again, I thought, well, we had the GI Bill. You just had to take advantage of the opportunity. So if you didn't take advantage of it, must have been your own fault. I'll get you that, Jennifer. You would really enjoy this book.
Somebody else have a response? Or Jeff, I see you went.
No, I was just going to ask if someone else wanted to follow up.
So LeAnn, this is Steve, and it's more of a follow-on to that research on the GI Bill. You referenced redlining, and I think some of us have become aware of some of the restrictive housing policies that were implemented in the northern states. But I guess my question is, in your research, did you find that there were also these policies of allocating money that got moved to the states and therefore got restricted to the white privilege class in terms of how they were doled out as it related to housing? Or farm ownership is another one that I've heard little bits about.
Yeah, but it's done in a little different way, Steve. So what happened was, and let's just use Chicago in the north. Let's get out of the south for a minute and just talk about Chicago. So when the FHA was created in 1934, it was created for purposes of encouraging home ownership. But in order to determine whether or not the FHA was going to guarantee a loan, and that's what the FHA did, it was guaranteeing mortgages. They obviously, for good reason, have to make sure that the collateral that secures the loan has value and is worth the value of the loan. But what they did very early on is that they made a decision that if the property was in a neighborhood where any African Americans lived, it by definition was not worthy of insurance by the FHA. And they literally put red lines around neighborhoods. And it did not have to be primarily Black. If there was any Black in a neighborhood, it got a red line. And so that's why we see in Chicago, we see neighborhoods that are primarily Black. Now, for those folks that were able to get into white neighborhoods, the stories are legion about the discrimination that they faced and the violence that they faced to get out of those white neighborhoods. So whether or not it is a matter of states doling out government money in a discriminatory fashion, or the way that mortgages and banks and lenders operated to make sure that the African Americans did not have access to the lovely suburbs that were going up around the city. They wanted to keep Black folks in the urban areas. And that was one way that they could do it. The language that they use, of course, this language is long gone. But why it is important to know about this language, because when you see how these policies progressed, and it took years to finally get rid of all that language, how can I then say, well, systemic racism ended with the Civil Rights Act, when there was this buildup for generations to control where Black folks were going to live? You can't just snap your fingers and get rid of it.
Yeah.
That's the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow. It goes all the way up to present day.
Thanks. Anne, you had a question in the chat. Do you mind stating it yourself?
Sure. I just muted myself because I'm outside and had a lot of action around me. LeAnn, I wanted to ask you a question about the GI Bill. My understanding is that it discriminated against African Americans all over this country, not just in the South. Are you telling us that the northern banks and states operated differently?
No, I'm not telling you that.
Okay.
What I'm telling you is because, you know, a lot of the focus is on the southern states. You know, after Reconstruction, you know, with the Black codes, the northern states did not have the so-called Black codes. But when it came to things like the GI Bill, the northern states were just as guilty at the
And redlining.
And redlining, absolutely, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. No, the North was not immune from the handing out of because the federal government allowed all the distribution money to be handled by the states. That's where the abuse was allowed to take place.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Greg Frazados has added a helpful resource in the chat you can take a look at. And LeAnn's book also addressed this, or sorry, LeAnn's paper addressed this, used this resource, The Color of Law, quite a lot, which I know Greg has also read and referred to. That's a good resource. Who else has a question, comment, response? Paul Van Zuden.
Morning, everyone.
Oh.
I'm going to read a verse from the Quran.
Mm.
O mankind, we created you from a single pair of a male and a female, and made you into nations and tribes, that ye may know each other, not that you may despise each other. I think that's beautiful, but I guess my question is, by knowing people of color, is your life richer? Do you feel better internally from opening up to people of all colors?
I'm hesitating because this is where the tears are going to start. Paul, my life is immensely richer because of the experience that I've had at Garrett with students there of all colors. My life is immensely richer because of my relationships with the young men on the south side of Chicago. And my life is immensely richer because of the African-American relationships I have in my life, who have been with me on this journey, who have walked with me on this journey. And I got to tell you all, who have been patient with me. I'll never forget, this was four years ago, right when I started at Garrett. I was really going through a difficult time. I didn't really like the Black Lives Matter movement. I thought that they were trying to be divisive. You know, don't all lives matter. And I called on my dear friend, Dr. Harris, and he met me at Pete's coffee shop in Evanston. And when I say that my life is immensely enriched because of the patience of a few of my close Black friends, Dr. Harris is at the top because he listened very carefully to my angst about Black Lives Matter. And I'll never forget, I said, Bob, all lives matter, all lives matter. And you can all see this. He sat back in his chair and he said, well, LeAnn, the reason that we have to remind people that Black lives matter is that everyone has always known that white lives matter. Think about that. So yes, my life has been greatly enriched, and I pray that it continues to be blessed in that fashion.
Thank you.
LeAnn,
I'll
I
just
wanted
add,
to
just if
sorry, go
I
ahead, Paul.
might add quickly, I sent Jeffrey a piece that Myers Leonard, who was on the Miami Heat basketball team, wrote. And one of his quotes was, all lives don't matter until Black lives matter. Which I thought was very insightful.
Yeah.
LeAnn, as a follow-up to Paul's question, and it's such a great question because it's not, it takes things down from the intellectual, the analytical to the human, to the relational, and to the covenantal, which is what that passage from the Quran is talking about, our covenant framed by God with each other and for each other, when we can't just unwrite, even if we might want to. You've talked to me several times, mentioned to me a few times about an interaction in a small group, a discussion group at Garrett. And there was a younger African-American student who shared some reflections with you about her sense of trust or distrust and fatigue about just being in conversation and what happens sometimes when white folks are in the room.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could speak to that because it's a great example of how, yes, your life is richer, but sometimes it's enriched by very difficult things being revealed to you, to all of us, and bumping into them and saying, wow, I had no idea, that wasn't my intention. And it speaks to the broader reality of racism, not just on a personal level. But could you talk about, you remember the interaction
I'll
I'm
be happy
talking
to
about?
do that, because this was another one of those moments that I realized, JS, how blind I was, and was still very blind. We were in a small class of maybe only 8 or 9 people, and it was on theological anthropology of all things. And there was a young woman there who was probably in her early 30s. She's from Chicago, and I had been in class with her, was in several other classes. And I always really appreciated her comments. I appreciated her insight, her intellect, and we would have lovely conversations after class together. Now we're in this separate class it's a small class, and it's all women. And the Black women in the class were talking about what it means to work with white women. And this same young woman who I just told you about, she said, I'm not working with white women ever again. And I was like, I took offense. I thought, what do you mean you're not going to work with me? She was so brutally honest. She said, I'm done and I'm tired. Because every time I get in a small group with white women, they take over. They completely take over. It's their voices that have to be heard. It's their voices that decide how we're going to do what we're going to do. And she said, I'm tired. I'm not going to do it anymore. And that was one of the times where I realized, and I'm so much more intentional about this now, when I am in a group that includes especially Black women, I make sure that I keep my own voice in check. And that's the awareness that comes with understanding a little bit better their life experience. You know, white women like me can tend to think that they know it all, and then they have to, be the first one to speak. So I'm very intentional now when I'm in certain groups to do, let's just put it this way, I'm a better listener now than I was before.
Thank you, LeAnn. Other questions?
Andrea Anderson?
LeAnn, I have a question just to make sure I understand. Do you feel that in the country and in the state, the laws are okay, that they're structurally okay? It's just the way they're interpreted and the way policies have been written at, let's say, corporations and other organizations. Is that where the discrimination comes in, or are there inherent problems with our laws?
So, Andrea,
or can you not separate them? I don't know.
Well, no, you can, but here's why I'm struggling. There are so many laws, and that's why I'm not going to say, oh yes, there's no problem with laws. But let me try to answer your question this way. We have laws against housing discrimination now. We've had the Fair Housing Act since 1968. But keep in mind, Andrea, the fact that we have laws doesn't prevent discrimination in housing. We have laws against murder and rape. We still have murderers and rapers. It doesn't stop the behavior. And with our federal discrimination laws, while they are in place, they have to be enforced, which means if you feel you've been discriminated against, you have to go through the process of enforcing the law. And one of the things that you've heard me say before is while we have these laws in place, laws do not change hearts. That's where our own work comes into play. And an example that I use is in our criminal court system in Chicago. A lot of the guys that I work with, they will go in front of a white judge who simply has just seen enough. And if a young black man comes up to him and, you know, with his pants falling down his backside and tattooed in a hoodie, automatically he's assuming, he's making assumptions about him based upon the color of his skin and his dress. And because there's so much discretion involved, he can do what he wants. So while we have the right laws in place now that discriminate at a federal level and at a state level against discrimination based on sex, creed, color of your skin, sexual identity, that doesn't mean that this discrimination is going to stop, because it hasn't.
Yes.
I would love to share something with all of you. I just found this out last week. One of a student at Garrett, he's in a second year MDiv program. He's doing his field placement at a Methodist church in Evanston. Just last week, he went to go do the recording for the service. This was on a Thursday. He goes to enter the building. A white woman stops him, who's in the building, and won't let him in. And she said, "What are you doing here? And who are you?" And he told her, and she said, "Well, who are you here to see? I need a name." And then she shut the door again, locked it. Now, this young man had a key card to get in. He was not going to use it. He waited till she came back and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, please come in." That young man then had to go record prayers of the people. And he had to record for the service. Can you imagine his mindset after having gone through something like that? And then having to get into the mindset of a pastor? So Andrea, we have laws, but they don't change the hearts of people.
Kelly Anderson had a question, and then I see Heather Crimmins next.
Good morning, LeAnn.
Good morning, Kelly.
So I loved what you shared about your conversation with Dr. Harris. I remember your sermon in which Dr. Harris was present, and you also recalled your conversations. And I thought you touched on something so beautifully poignant. It's definitely been a realization for me that while those engaging conversations are so fruitful and so important for us as white people to understand and to genuinely listen to, there's also this realization that those who are Black do not owe us a conversation, an education. They don't owe us any of that. And in essence, Dr. Harris, I mean, a man of such grace, to sit and have what arguably is not an easy conversation in a Pete's coffee shop, but him able to sit there and have the grace to once again patiently explain to a white woman of privilege why Black Lives Matter goes to show, one, just how incredible he is, but two, also sitting back and saying, I'm so grateful for this conversation, and I also realize you don't owe that to me. And I just thought that juxtaposition is really beautiful, just the realization of it.
Yeah, Kelly, I'm so glad you raised that, because you're absolutely correct. It is not the responsibility of African Americans to teach us about the caste system. It is folks who identify as white who've been the beneficiaries of that caste system for generations. And it is our responsibility to understand how we got to where we are today and to do the work to dismantle that caste system. I had a professor who was on my thesis committee, African-American professor who I respect obviously immensely. I asked him to be my advisor. He was the professor who said to me, LeAnn, I want you to research the word whiteness. Now, the reason why he was saying this to me is that for his class, I had to come up with a final topic for my paper in his class. His class was emancipatory pedagogy. It's how you use the gospel and Christian education to set people free. And I said, I really want to work on something that will help me with my work on the South Side. And he looked at me and said, I want you to Google the word whiteness. I didn't know what whiteness was. I've never heard the word whiteness. Believe me, whiteness is not in the legal lexicon. We don't talk about whiteness. I went home And I Googled whiteness. And, you know, Jennifer where's my Jennifer? I'm sure she's still on. There you are. You know, you said, you know, what are the resources? Is there's things out there? If you, Jennifer, would see the stuff that exists in the academic world on whiteness, on what it means, how it was developed, it will really blow you away. So getting back to this African-American professor, I then sat down and talked with him about this because I was going through my, oh my God, now I see this. And I'll never forget, it was just he and I after class. And he's also still a full-time pastor. So he's very pastoral. He's not just an academic. And he's sitting talking to me about whiteness and what this means. And the tears are streaming down my face because I couldn't believe what I was reading and what I was missing for so many years. And I started asking him questions, and he said, now, not as lovingly as Dr. Harris would say. In fact, he did not say this very lovingly at all. He said, LeAnn, it is not my job to teach you about racism. And I felt smacked. And he was absolutely right. Which I later went back to thank him for saying that to me, because it required me to do the work myself. So thank you for raising that, Kelly. It's really important. These conversations that we get with our Black brothers and sisters are truly moments of grace.
Thank you, LeAnn. Before we move on to Heather, Andrea, I'd like to go back to you because you may have had a follow-up to your previous question and we don't want to miss that.
No, I didn't really have a follow-up. I'm glad at least a well-respected attorney thinks the laws are in place. I understand overcoming the human heart is a whole different story. But now, just based on your last comment, I'm just thinking of how hard women had to fight for our rights and our right to vote and everything. It's not like the other gender was doing our fighting. And I'm all for trying to help the underdog, even though Blacks aren't underdogs. They're less advantaged right now. But in a way, they have to do their own fighting too, because not enough of us are going to be like you or like hopefully us in terms of having an open mind and trying to do the right thing.
Andrea, they've been fighting for years.
Yeah.
They are doing their own fight. It's just that fortunately more white people are waking up to fight alongside with them or behind them.
Okay.
I prefer, the image I use in my mind is I want to follow their lead. I want to follow their lead. They've been fighting for years. We just haven't been paying attention.
Following with what you just said in terms of fighting behind and following the lead and not this sense of fighting for, can you talk a little bit about your work with Chicago Cred and with the men that you're working with there and their receptivity to you and your sort of role with them, and if sometimes they feel like you just can't know?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. I was really, really hesitant about doing this work. When I met with Arnie Duncan and was fascinated about his work with Cred and wanted to do what I could do, I'd assumed that I would be using my business skills, you know, whatever I could do, but I thought it was using my business skills. And when I met with the director of the Roseland group, I had a long conversation with her, told her what I was doing. I was in seminary, and she said, you know, LeAnn, would you consider leading devotions with these guys? They need Jesus in their life. And I about fell out of my chair. And of course I said, oh, I'd be happy to. I had no idea how I was going to do this. This has been going on for almost 3 years now. And I was also very concerned about how they would receive me, because there are no white folks where I go in Roseland. I don't remember last time I saw anyone white walking down the street. And I felt subconscious, what are they going to think of me? It was amazing of how responsive they were. I had underestimated their ability to be accepting. I was also told by the life coaches that these guys can smell a fraud a mile away. And fortunately, I wasn't told that till I'd been there like a year. Because I didn't know what that would mean.
You had passed the test by that point.
Right, exactly. And Heather, I have to tell you, what I have found, the biggest value that I can give to these young men is to reinforce that they are loved, that they are children of God, and that they do not have to take the story that society and culture has written for them. They have the ability to write their own story. And it's amazing how few people they have in their corner. So when you just sit down and talk with these guys, I also think that they're not going to sit down. Now I just meet one-on-one with them. They're not going to sit down and talk with me unless somebody's already told them about me. They're not going to do that. But I think I have over the few years established enough credibility with the group that oh yeah, I'll go see Ms. Pope. Sometimes we talk about faith. Most of the time we don't. We talk about families. We talk about trauma. We talk about the people they've lost. But what I try to do is to pivot then the discussion to what does it mean to hope? Because these guys don't know what it means to hope. They really don't think they're going to live past the age of 24. It's either going to be prison or they're going to be dead. So to give them a sense of hope that something else exists for them is, to me, that's the gospel in action, is giving people hope. Whether or not I talk about the gospel or not, that's what I think we are charged to do.
Leanna, I wonder if, picking up, you said the gospel in action, and we talk about the good news, we talk about the word of God, God's word of love, and whether we're researching and we're coming to a new awareness, getting to know what we didn't know, whether we're in conversation and we're trying to create a human bridge, harkening back to Paul's question and comment about relationship, words matter. Words matter. We have to have words that can build this bridge. And you talked about feeling kind of almost slapped by that professor and pastor who told you it's not a Black person's prerogative to educate you about Black experience. That's your job, so you can be part of the solution, not a continued part of the problem. So I'm just wanting you to talk with us a little bit about what you've learned about the importance of language in this work of anti-racism. And are there certain words that maybe, do we really have to talk about those words? Because sometimes whites can feel slapped or can feel resistance to those words, white supremacy, whiteness, white privilege. I mean, can't we just move past these words and get to the work, because sometimes they sting, and are they really productive? Do we need to talk about these words? Can you talk a little bit about your opinion about language and maybe those phrases and words in particular?
Jeff, I don't think we can just move through those words and phrases in the uncomfort and get to the other side of the work. And I am very intentional. In fact, perhaps some of you have picked up already this morning, I'm very intentional about the words I use and don't use. I like to look at racism through the lens of a caste system now, not because those words and phrases make me uncomfortable. I've already been through that discomfort. I write about it in my paper. White supremacy is a term that really made me cringe, because white supremacists are those ugly white men in the South. I had to live through that discomfort, and I strongly encourage all of you that, and you will feel it in your body. You will read words, you will read phrases, and you will cringe. You will have two reactions. You will either say, this doesn't apply to me, which is what I did, or you will say, you know what, I can just keep moving without having to read about white supremacy. I encourage you to sit with the discomfort, to sit with feeling the cringe, because only when you do can you get through it, not past it, through it, so that those terms, the terminology, they no longer make you cringe. You accept it for what it is, and then no, let's talk about white supremacy. That term no longer makes me cringe. I'm not defensive about it, because that term means to me is that there is always been a system where people with white skin have been considered superior in this country. And we can't dispute that. Based on the color of our skin, there's a superiority ranking with dark skin at the bottom. But once I started thinking, but wait a minute, now that I understand it, and I can take my own agency to do something about it, rather than feeling discomforted about those phrases, I now use them as a sort of power, because I can take them, I can embrace them and say, this is what we need to work toward to break down. So look at it this way, Jeff. We don't jump over it. We don't battle our way through it. You need to sit with it. You need to sit with it and then work your way through it. Oh, and Jeff, let me say one more thing. I know that a lot of authors are bashing white fragility and you know, we shouldn't have white fragility and it's horrible. Whites are so fragile. You're right. We are fragile. I was fragile. But I have also come to believe firmly that there's not a sin with being born white. I said this in the interview. I no longer take offense or feel that I am defensive because of my privilege, because I've learned that it's not a sin to be privileged, and there's nothing wrong with being born with white skin and being privileged. It's how you use it. So if you make the decision that you're going to use your white privilege in the way that it's meant to be used, that's a real sense of freedom, a real sense of freedom. And that's what helped me move past my own white fragility, my tears in front of my professor.
Yeah. The founders of the St. Bernard Project, Liz McCartney and her partner, said that their job, they do disaster recovery in the wake of hurricanes, one of which is battering the coast now, as we know. They said their job is to be in the business of working themselves out of business. And if white privilege can be leveraged in a positive way, certainly the goal of any white privilege, of any privilege, is to be able to work our way out of having that privilege so that it doesn't exist. Privilege is obviously a function of caste. I think we're kind of at a natural stopping point.
I want to thank Jeff Brunn and LeAnn Pope for leading our conversation today. LeAnn, for your heart, mind, passion, and your gift to us. To all these years of research and reading all these books and thinking and feeling so deeply and building relationships externally and internally. And now we get to enjoy the fruit that you've done. Thank you so much. Thank folks very much. Be well, everybody. Blessings, peace, and grace to you today and this week.